Our first attribute is the omniscience of God. It is just a big word that means that God knows everything. Now, this is really hard for us to comprehend, for our capacity to know is limited. Our source of information, am I on the right one? Somehow I think, is omniscience? Okay, I thought I got my notes out of order here. Our sources of information are limited. Our ability to store that information is limited. But God does not have any of these limitations. His knowledge is perfect and complete. God never had to learn anything. God's never been confused. He's never gotten his facts mixed up. He's never forgotten anything. God knows instantly and effortlessly everything. Now remember that knowing and causing are two different things. People often like to blame God for the outcome of their life. Just because God knew doesn't mean he caused or he made you to do something. Now the omniscience of God is God knows everything, and it should have an effect on us. A few of the effects that we talked about before: quit trying to hide your sin. It is in our nature to try to hide our sin. But remember, God already knows everything. There is no hiding anything from him. But remember, he knew your shortcomings, he knew your failures and your faults, and chose to love you anyway. But quit trying to hide your sin. 2, we ought to let him guide us. You know, you could take your chances on a blind guide. You could take your investment advice from a man who keeps his money in a piggy bank. But letting someone who has perfect knowledge lay out your path sure seems like a much better idea. We ought to let him guide us. He has omniscience. We ought to let him guide us. 3, quit trying to educate God. Sometimes we like to air our thoughts and our emotions to God, and that's okay, but realize when you're doing that you're not telling God anything. We don't need to educate God. He doesn't need to be brought up to speed. He doesn't need you to explain the situation. He doesn't need you to figure out the problem and then educate him on how he could fix this problem. He already knows. He's omniscient, so quit trying to educate him. And 4, as always, worship. Aren't you glad that you have a God who cannot be fooled, who knows every detail, and is willing to use that knowledge on your behalf? He is worthy of worship. Omnipresence of God. Now, as we see, God is all present, or God is everywhere. Now, it's not pantheism that God is in everything or everything is God, but God is present everywhere. Now, we tend to think in terms of time and space. We think of when we draw close to God, of having to go somewhere. We think in terms of proximity. But God is present everywhere. In fact, it's hard to get your mind to really wrap around, but God is physically as close to you in the tavern as he is at church. It kind of makes your mind do a double take, but God is everywhere present. The difference is our awareness of that presence. There are places where you might go and things you might do where God would refuse to make you aware of his presence. And there are places you might go where you would not want God to be aware of God's presence at that place. Either way, God is present all the same. The only difference is our awareness of his presence. And that ought to affect us. We ought to draw nigh. Number 1, we ought to draw nigh. Since God is omnipresent, this isn't physical. You don't have to go somewhere to get close to the Lord. It means that there are things that can hinder your awareness of his presence. So get rid of them. Get rid of anything that robs you of the awareness of God's presence. He's omnipresent, so draw nigh. 2, live in that presence. Heaven is not some place that you go to, although it is a place that you go to. That's not what makes heaven heaven. It's not just some place you're going to go someday. Heaven is heaven because of the constant awareness of God's presence. So draw nigh and stay there. Live moment by moment in the presence of your God. And 3, reach the lost. We're kind of coming at this from the other side, but this is a really heavy thought here. Hell is the continual absence of the awareness of God's presence. The whole world lives in the grace of God. Whether they know it or not, whether they recognize it or not, the grace of God is pouring out on this planet all the time. And we have everybody on this planet has lived under the grace and mercy of God. Most of them unaware of it. But when a person dies and goes to hell, any awareness of that presence, any benefit of his presence, at that moment is lost forever. That is the most terrifying thought that I can personally think. The loss of the awareness of God's presence or the benefit of it forever. Nothing is more fearful than that. Now, how can we who know the sweetness of God's presence let the people around us be lost from that presence without ever saying a word to them? God's omnipresence should cause us to reach the lost. Number 4, as always, we should worship. Don't wait for Sunday. Don't wait for church. God is omnipresent. Quit ignoring him. Throughout the day, worship him. Our 4th attribute tonight is wisdom. Now here we have a common word that we all at least know what the definition is. It's the ability to think and act using knowledge, experience, and understanding. Or maybe an easier definition is the ability to deal with a situation and obtain a favorable outcome. God has perfect wisdom. Man's wisdom is often not wisdom at all, but foolishness. Man's wisdom is, if he has any, is compartmentalized. He may be a genius in this one area, but he is a total washout in the other area. Man's wisdom has limitations. It can be measured. And God's wisdom is the exact opposite of all of that. God's wisdom is infinite, which is why Paul calls him the only wise God. Yeah. Compared to him, nobody has any wisdom. If I said about some wise man, we measure his wisdom in millimeters, which you know is a really small mark on your tape measure. We measure his wisdom in millimeters. And I said in the same breath, we measure God's wisdom in light years. I would still be doing God a disservice. I would still be limiting the wisdom of God. It is so far above ours. It's not even, he is the only wise God. And what effect should that have? Well, we ought to trust him. Don't just say it. We often say, oh, God's wise. Trust him. If he's wise, then trust him. Let him have full course in your life. 2, seek his wisdom. I don't care how many roads you've been down, I don't know how all the bumps you've had and all the school of hard knocks. You're never going to arrive. You're never going to be able to stand on your own. Wisdom, true wisdom, is continually looking for his wisdom. If any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not. And then worship him. He is the only wise God. There's nothing that he doesn't know how to fix.